Lieutenant Carson Vale stood at the edge of the command deck aboard the TSS Valor, a massive Terran battleship stationed near the edge of known space. Watching the alien ambassador enter the chamber with a presence that silenced everyone. She was tall, graceful, and almost glowing. Her silver skin shimmered softly, her long white hair flowing like light itself, and her violet eyes scanned the room with a quiet authority that made even the hardened officers of Earth's military stand straighter. Her name was Varelian, and she came from the Valari, a mysterious race that rarely left their hidden worlds, famous for their ancient technology, their unmatched elegance, and the fact that they had never lost a war. She walked past the Terran officers with the calm strength of someone who knew she was not in danger, despite being deep in human territory. Carson had never seen anyone like her. She wasn't just beautiful, she was otherworldly, unreachable, unbelievable. As she moved closer, Carson found himself whispering under his breath, barely thinking, "She's so beautiful. ... I wish I had a wife like her. It wasn't meant for anyone." It's a foolish thought, spoken quietly. At the silence on the deck sharpened instantly. Varelian paused. She turned her head slowly, her piercing eyes locking directly onto his. The deck froze. The translator device, attached to her neck, pulsed once as she walked straight to Carson, her steps echoing through the silence. The officers didn't move. Carson's heart pounded. He didn't know what to do, whether to salute, speak, or vanish into the floor. Varelian stopped in front of him, only inches away. She was taller than him by a head, her gaze unblinking. "You spoke a vow," she said calmly, her voice like crystal bells in cold air. "Your words were sacred. You have proposed." "I accept." Carson blinked, confused, thinking it was some kind of joke, or maybe a translation error. "Proposed?" he asked, glancing at his fellow officers for help, but no one said a word. "White tie didn't mean," Varelian raised a hand, and the room hushed again. "In my culture, such words, spoken with heart, bind soul to soul. You have called me, your chosen. I have heard you. I have accepted. We are now joined." Pulse of blue light spread across her chest plate symbols, appearing in elegant patterns, like circuitry blooming into flowers. Carson could barely breathe. "I didn't mean it," he muttered. "It was a mistake. Just a whisper." Varelian tilted her head slightly, considering. "In your world, perhaps words are thrown like dust in the wind. In mine, words are anchors. You have spoken. I have answered." Carson felt his legs weaken, his thoughts racing, and then the emergency sirens blared across the ship. Lights turned red. The control deck snapped into motion. Incoming fleet. Someone shouted. Unknown signatures. 5 alien vessels approaching fast, hostile configuration. Varelian's eyes narrowed. Her voice became hard. "It is them. It's the coalition that hunts my kind. They have followed me here. Here, you are now their target as well." Carson looked at her. "Why?" "Because I have joined you. And now, by ancient code, your people and mine are one." She turned, her white hair swirling like a comet's tail. "I must prepare." She strode off the deck, and Carson, shocked, dazed, and half panicking, followed. Minutes later, he found her inside a high-security chamber. Her armor, unlike anything he had seen before, was alive. It responded to her touch, forming around her body like liquid metal, reshaping with thought. "You're not just an ambassador," Carson said quietly. Rove, which word is with, where, we now, we, where, we adds, where I, will, wed, We, I, we, you, I, we, She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted a glowing spear from the wall, the weapon humming with power. "The war you feared has come," she said, walking past him, "and now we must fight it together, husband." The word struck him like a physical blow. Carson barely had time to grab a sidearm before she dragged him toward the ship's teleport chamber. "We're going to the enemy flagship," she said. "Why?" he shouted. "Because the fastest way to stop a war is to cut off its head." Carson had no time to argue. Moments later, they stood on an enemy ship, surrounded by warriors with insect-like armor and 4 arms each. Varelian moved like lightning, her spear spinning, striking, slicing through metal and bone alike, while Carson fired with precision, staying behind her, covering her flank. They made their way to the command center. Explosions shook the ship. The enemy leader, towering creature with obsidian skin and glowing red eyes, stepped forward to stop them. Varelian didn't hesitate. Their battle was short, violent, and decisive. The enemy fell. The ship shuddered. "It's time to leave," Carson gasped, helping her as they ran. Laported just before the ship exploded in space, taking half the enemy fleet with it. Back on the Valar, Varelian stood beside him, blood on her armor, glowing symbols still marking her chest. She looked at him, not with contempt or amusement, but with a quiet, thoughtful gaze. "You are brave," she said. "More than I expected. Perhaps your vow was not foolish after all." Carson, still breathing heavily, leaned against the wall, looking at her. "This is a lot," he muttered. "I didn't expect to fight a war or get married today." Varelian's lips curved slightly. "Few great things begin with expectations." Outside the ship, the remnants of the enemy fleet retreated. Earth's defenses had held for now, but war had arrived. A marriage, accidental or not, had triggered an ancient code among alien civilizations, and now all eyes in the galaxy were turning toward Earth, wondering what kind of species could inspire a Valkyrie warrior to accept a Terran's whisper as fate. Carson didn't know what came next, but as Varelian stood beside him, luminous and fierce, one thing was certain: the war had changed, and so had his life. The moment the enemy fleet appeared in Earth's orbit, the calm on the command deck of the TSS Valor shattered like glass, and alarms screamed through the ship while officers scrambled to their stations, shouting orders and trying to coordinate the Terran defense forces. But in the middle of all the chaos stood Varelian, silent and still, her glowing eyes fixed on the display screen that showed the hostile ships advancing fast. And though no fear touched her face, the tension in the air wrapped around everyone like ice. While Lieutenant Carson Vale stood beside her, still struggling to believe what had happened just hours earlier, he had made a simple, quiet comment. And now he was bound to an alien warrior, not just any alien, but a Valari noble, and possibly the most dangerous one alive. And the worst part was, he hadn't even gotten used to calling her his wife before war had come knocking. Yet now, with Earth's skies darkening and ships from 5 alien species ready to strike, Varelian turned to him and said in her calm voice, "This is no longer a matter of alliance or diplomacy. This is blood." And without waiting for a reply, she stepped into the ship's secure chamber where her war armor was kept, and Carson followed, drawn in by a mixture of fear and strange curiosity, watching as her ceremonial robe dissolved into tiny, glowing particles and was replaced by something entirely different, a living armor that wrapped around her like smoke turned to steel. Elegant yet powerful, covered in symbols that pulsed like veins of light. And when she turned back to him, She no longer looked like a guest of Earth, but like a queen from some ancient empire rising to conquer the stars. And he barely managed to ask what she planned to do before she said, "I will take command of the forward strike team. You will come with me," which made no sense to Carson, who had never led anything more than a scout mission. It wasn't trained in Valari tactics, but Varelian simply looked at him and added, "You are now bound to me, not just in title, but in duty." And with that, he found himself rushing through the ship, past squads of human marines and Valari support soldiers who had suddenly appeared from hidden corners of the ship, as if they had been waiting for a signal. And it was only then that he realized Varelian hadn't come alone. She had brought warriors with her, warriors who moved with terrifying silence and discipline. And now those warriors were preparing for a counterattack while Earth was still scrambling to raise its planetary shields. And when the teleport platform activated, sending Varelian, Carson, and a dozen hybrid soldiers to the enemy flagship, Carson's stomach dropped as he saw the interior of the hostile vessel. It was dark, filled with sharp angles and pulsing red lights. And the air smelled like oil and ash, and almost instantly they were under fire. Beams of plasma slashing through the corridors while alien troops poured from hidden doors. But Varelian moved like a storm of blades, her energy spear dancing through the air, cutting down attackers with such speed that Carson could barely follow her movements, and he fired his rifle in short bursts, oozing cover and instincts to stay alive, knowing deep down that he was completely out of his depth, yet somehow managing to hold the line behind her. And as they pushed forward, taking control of corridor after corridor, Varelian spoke to him between battles, her voice steady despite the chaos, telling him that the enemy species had formed a temporary alliance to destroy the Valari legacy. And now that she had joined with a human, they saw Earth as a new threat. Because her marriage to a Terran meant the ancient protections of the star-clad court would extend to humanity, and the other species feared what that meant for the balance of power in the galaxy, especially if humanity gained access to Valari weapons and star-forging technology. And while Carson tried to make sense of this political storm, he also realized that he was walking into history, not just as a soldier, but as someone who had become the link between two great civilizations. And as they reached the command chamber of the enemy flagship, they were met by the ship's commander, a hulking creature with black armor fused to its skin, 4 arms, and a mouth full of jagged teeth, who roared and attacked without warning, slamming its fists into the floor and sending out a shockwave that knocked several soldiers off their feet. But Varelian charged forward without fear, her spear glowing white-hot as it clashed with the beast's claws, and their battle shook the ship. Sparks flying, metal groaning, and Carson knew he couldn't just stand there. He spotted a console, ran to it, and began hacking into the ship's systems, using the enemy's own network to trigger a feedback loop that would disable their power grid. And just as the commander landed a crushing blow on Varelian's shoulder, knocking her back, Carson hit the final command, and the ship's stuttered lights died, gravity flickered, and alarms howled. And in that moment of weakness, Varelian rose and drove her spear straight through the enemy's heart, ending the fight in a blinding flash. And before the ship could stabilize, they retreated, teleporting back to the Valar seconds before the enemy vessel imploded in a blaze of energy that lit the sky like a second sun. And as the crew around them cheered, Carson slumped to the floor, his heart racing, his body bruised, but alive. And Varelian stood over him, her armor scarred and glowing, and for the first time, she knelt beside him and said, "You have done more than survive. You have begun to understand what it means to stand beside me." And as Carson tried to speak, she touched his shoulder gently, adding, "We are not finished. This was only the first wave." And with those words, the weight of the future pressed down on him, because now he understood the truth. The marriage was not just a bonded, was a declaration of alliance between worlds. And the enemies of the Valari would never stop coming, not as long as she lived. And now Neither would he. The days after the first battle passed like a blur, and the TSS Valor drifted through the quiet darkness of space. Its hull scarred, and its crew tired. But peace did not follow victory. Only silence, and, in that silence, fear began to grow, because deep in the stars, hidden fleets were moving. And whispers from scout ships spoke of strange energy readings, and planets vanishing from maps without a trace, while inside the ship, Lieutenant Carson Vale trained harder than ever before, knowing that the war was not over, just paused, and beside him, always sharp and unshaken, was Varelian, who never seemed to rest, as if sleep were a weakness her kind had long outgrown. And though Carson still felt overwhelmed by the scale of what he had fallen into, something inside him had started to shift, a quiet fire burning, brighter every day, because every time he saw her walking through the Valor's halls, commanding respect, moving like a blade, and speaking with the calm of someone who had seen centuries pass, he remembered the vow he had spoken, even if it had been by accident. And now, with each passing mission, each scar earned in battle, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the vow had come from something real inside him, something even he hadn't known yet. And one evening, as stars passed slowly outside the observation deck, he found Varelian standing alone, watching the void, her armor folded away, dressed in a long robe that shimmered like moonlight, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "There is a world," she said, "a place of my people, hidden behind firewalls of space and time, where the star-clad court waits." And when Carson asked why she was telling him this now, she turned and said, "Because they have summoned me, and, by our bond, they summon you too." And before he could respond, the floor beneath them shifted, the hum of the ship changed, and the stars warped as the Valor entered a new fold jump, the ancient Valerie coordinates overriding human navigation, sending them toward a part of the galaxy even Earth's long-range scanners had never touched. And as the ship passed through folded space, the crew looked on in awe as they arrived in a system of fire and crystal, where stars burned blue and a massive ringed planet floated ahead. The city on its surface that looked more like a dream than anything made by hands, towers of glass and gold, bridges suspended in air, and lights that moved like living constellations as they approached. A voice came through the comms, not a sound, but a presence, filling the minds of all aboard. "Welcome, warrior and consort." And the ship slowed as a beam of silver light pulled it gently into orbit, while Varelian stood taller than before, her expression unreadable. And once they landed, she walked beside Carson down the ramp, through paths made of star metal, and into the heart of the star-clad court, where beings of light and armor sat in thrones carved from comets, their eyes glowing with knowledge and judgment, and the leader, a figure so old its name was lost to time, rose and said, "You have broken the silence. Varelian, you have taken a vow beyond your world." And though the words held no anger, there was weight in them, and Carson felt it pressing into his chest. But before he could speak, Varelian stepped forward, voice steady. "I accepted the vow because it was true in its innocence. It was not spoken in deceit, but in awe, and I accepted it, not as weakness, but as hope." And a murmur moved through the court, like wind over glass, and the eldest of them asked Carson, "And you, human, do you stand by the words you whispered?" And in that moment, with all eyes upon him, Carson remembered the moment he saw her, how his breath had caught, how something inside him had stirred, and, though he hadn't meant for any of this to happen, he nodded and said, "Yes, I do." And as those words left his mouth, the court fell into silence again, till the elder spoke. Then the bond must be sealed in fire, and without warning, flames rose around them, not heat, but something deeper, burning through doubt and fear, showing Carson images of Varelian's past, battles fought on dead moons, betrayals survived, glories lost, and hopes buried, and she saw his pain, his loneliness, his wish for something bigger than himself, and in that fire, the vow became real, not by words, but by truth. And when the flames faded, Varelian reached out and took his hand for the first time, her touch warm, her expression calm, and the court nodded as one. It is done. And for a moment, Carson felt something strange, peace, as if two pieces of a puzzle had finally fit together. But peace never lasted in wartime. And as they turned to leave the court, alarms sounded, and visions filled the sky, dark ships breaching the protective veil around the Violari system. Massive vessels covered in bone and stone, older than any known empire. And Varelian's face went cold. They have awakened the obsidian kin, she whispered, and Carson asked who they were. But she only said, they do not conquer, they erase. And within minutes, the Valor was back in orbit, its weapons charged. Human and Violari forces combining, preparing for a defense that would test every limit. And as the enemy fleet descended, Carson stood on the bridge, looking at the woman beside him, not just his commander, not just his ally, but now his chosen, in a way that no longer felt like chance. And as the stars lit up with a glow of battle, he knew the vow was not just spoken, it had been forged in fire. The enemy ships came like shadows, swallowing light, spreading across the Valerie skies, with black holes shaped like twisted bones. Their weapons silent for now, but their threat clear. And as the Valor floated high above the star-clad court, Carson Vale stood at his station with his heart beating fast, watching the fleet grow larger on the display screen, while Varelian moved through the command deck with quiet focus, giving orders in a sharp tone that left no room for fear. And even though Carson had fought by her side before, this time felt different, heavier, like the fate of not just a planet, but something deeper was hanging by a thread. Because the Obsidian kin were not raiders or warlords. They were destroyers of memory, erasers of history. And even the mighty Valari feared them. And now that fear had reached Earth through its newest bond, as if one whispered vow had awakened ancient forces that should have remained asleep. And as the crew prepared weapons and shields, Varelian told Carson about the Heart Forge, a place at the core of her people's homeworld, hidden beneath the floating temples and crystal towers, where energy was drawn from the living core of the planet itself. Not just fuel or power, but something more, a living memory of the Valari, a source of strength that could forge weapons or bind souls. And now the court had agreed to let it be used in a way never tried before, to merge two wills into one force, human and Valari, not just in title or feeling, but in power. Hey, and though Carson didn't understand how, he agreed without hesitation. Because the enemy ships were coming closer, and his bond with Varelian was more than emotion. Now what was the only path left? And so they descended together into the deepest chamber of the planet, where the walls glowed with slow-moving rivers of light, and strange machines pulsed with energy that hummed in his bones. And at the center was the Heartforge itself, a great sphere floating in midair, beating like a second heart, wrapped in chains of silver flame. And the moment they stepped close, it spoke not in words, but in feelings, drawing out everything from their past, every loss, every moment of strength, and shaping it into something real. And Varelian took his hand again, whispering, "This will hurt." And Carson barely had time to ask what she meant before fire leaped from the Heartforge and wrapped around them both, not burning their bodies, but digging into their minds, their memories, their truths, binding them together in a way deeper than words or blood, showing them each other's souls without hiding anything. And in that storm of light, Carson saw the day Varelian had first gone to war, saw her kneel before the court to offer her life as their sword, and she saw him alone in his small apartment on Earth, watching the stars and wondering if he would ever be more than just another soldier in someone else's war. And when the flames faded, they stood locked in place. Changed, not hurt, but marked, glowing symbols running along their arms and up their necks. It's the same pattern on both of them, and the heart forge pulsed one last time before falling silent. And then it was done, the pact sealed, not by tradition, but by something older, something made of fire and will. And as they returned to the surface, the obsidian kin finally moved, their ships opening fire with silent waves of dark energy that struck the outer shields like thunder. Teen and explosions rippled across the sky, and the Valar shook as it took the first blast, but did not fall. And Varelian walked to the main deck, her armor different now, sharper, glowing faintly with the same light as the forge. And when Carson followed, he felt it to his movements quicker, his vision sharper, like something inside him had awakened. And the crew stared at them with quiet awe, knowing they were no longer just captain and officer, but something greater. And together, they led the fleet in a counterattack, ships flying in tight formations, firing back with beams of light pulled from the planet's core. And every time Carson and Varelian gave an order, the systems responded faster. The crew moved smoother, as if their unity was flowing into the machines around them. Okay. And in the middle of battle, they boarded one of the enemy dreadnoughts again, cutting through dark metal halls filled with crawling creatures made of ash and teeth, and fought their way to the control chamber, where a being unlike anything they had seen waited, a tall, silent figure wrapped in dark smoke, with a mask like shattered glass and a voice that echoed without sound. And it pointed at them and said, "You are breaking the cycle." And Varelian answered, "Then the cycle deserves to break." And the fight began, a clash of light and dark in a chamber of stone and fire. And Carson moved as if guided by instinct, blocking attacks he shouldn't have seen, striking where no gap existed. And when the final blow landed, Varelian and Carson struck together, her spear and his blade forged from the Heartforge pact, slicing through the enemy with a sound like breaking time. And as the creature vanished into dust, the ship around them began to collapse, but they escaped, warping back just in time as the enemy dreadnought exploded, sending shockwaves through the enemy fleet, which faltered and fell back. The sudden loss of their command, breaking their formation, and the battle ended, not with cheers, but with quiet, kind of silence that follows something close to death. And as the Valar returned to the Valerie city, the court met them not with cold judgment, but quiet respect. And the oldest one said, "You have forged a new path, and now you must walk it." And as the stars returned to their slow dance above, Carson stood beside Varelian, changed, not just in power, but in truth, knowing now that the vow had never been a mistake, and that something far worse was still waiting in the dark. The warning came from a drifting probe that had vanished for weeks, now returned with damage across its hull, and only one message in its broken signal: "They are coming through the twin suns." And when the message was decoded, the star-clad court fell into silence, for they knew what it meant. The obsidian kin had found another path, not through gates or space lanes, but through a rift between two dying stars on the edge of Villery-controlled space. A rift that no one dared to cross before, and now it pulsed with strange energy, growing wider each hour. And Varelian stood at the edge of the war table, eyes fixed on the image of those twin suns twisting around one another like a burning knot, her voice calm as she said, "This will be their real strike." And Carson knew she was right, for all their battles before had been tests, skirmishes meant to distract, and now the real threat was moving, slow but certain, through the rift. And if they reached the other side, the core worlds would fall. And so the star-clad fleet and the human warships aligned into a single force. For the first time, ships of light and steel flying beside vessels of gravity-bent metal and shimmering wings. And the TSS Valor led them all, its weapons humming with Heartforge energy, its crew united under a shared command. And when the fleet arrived near the twin suns, the stars themselves seemed to rage flares, rising like serpents, space folding and unfolding as gravity tore at the seams of reality. And from the center of the rift came the enemy, slow at first, then faster. Hundreds of ships with jagged bodies and living cores, moving like beasts instead of machines. And the battle began not with a warning, but with a scream that echoed across every channel. Not sound, but pure terror, designed to paralyze. Carson stood firm at his station, the mark of the Heartforge glowing faintly on his skin, and Varelian at his side raised her hand, signaling the attack, and the fleet responded like a single body light bursting from Valari lances, railguns firing from human cruisers, drones darting between enemy lines and striking weak spots learned in the last fight. And for a time, the battle was balanced. Fire traded for fire, energy clashing against shields. But then the suns began to shift, drawn by the pull of the rift, and a shadow appeared between them, massive and slow, shaped like a crown of bonzan, obsidian dreadinity, larger than anything they had seen before, with a core that pulsed like a black heart. And the moment it appeared, the stars dimmed, and the enemy ships surged with a new strength, as if the dread divinity was feeding them life. And suddenly, the allied fleet was pushed back, Valari ships crumbling under dark beams, human vessels sliced open by gravity spikes, and the Valor took a direct hit, alarms flashing, decks shaking, but it did not fall. Kent Carson shouted for repair crews while locking eyes with Varelian, who only nodded once and said, "We go." Inside, and he didn't question her, 'cause he felt it too. The dread identity couldn't be destroyed from the outside. It had to be torn apart from within. And they launched in a small strike vessel with only a few elite Valari and 2 human marines, flying fast and low through the chaos, dodging blasts and wreckage, pushing into the opening breach of the creature's hull. And inside, it was not metal, but living tissue, dark and pulsing, with walls that moved as if breathing, and lights that flickered like trapped souls. And they fought through strange guardians creatures of shadow and flame, echoing voices that tried to confuse and separate them. But Carson and Varelian moved together like a single force, their pact growing stronger with every step, their weapons striking in perfect rhythm. Finally, they reached a heart chamber, a sphere of black crystal hanging in a space of silence. And they saw within it the minds of the obsidian kin, not one, but many, bound together in endless hunger, a will that wanted to erase all things, to return the stars to stillness. And Varelian whispered, "This is why they destroy. They believe silence is purity." And Carson said, "Then we give them our noise." And together they placed their hands on the crystal. And the power of the Heartforge flowed through them, not to fight, but to speak. And what they spoke was not words, but memory, laughter, fear, hope, love, all the things that made life messy and bright and loud. And the crystal began to crack, not from force, but from truth, because the obsidian kin could not understand what they could not feel. And the breaking of the heart shattered the dread entity's will, sending a wave of pain through its fleet, which began to falter and collapse. And as they escaped back to their ship, the suns behind them surged, their light now breaking the rift apart, sealing it before more could come through. And when the allied fleet pulled back, silence that followed was not of fear, but of relief. And as the Valar returned to orbit above the Valari homeworld, the people gathered in lighted streets, no longer silent, no longer distant, but cheering, 'cause this time the war had not ended in retreat, but in unity. And Carson stood beside Varelian once more, not as her guest, not just her bond, but her equal. And yet he felt something still waiting, something moving in the dark behind it all. Because even as the stars calmed and the skies cleared, a small shard of that black crystal remained inside the Valor's storage chamber, pulsing faintly, unseen by the crew, and deep in its core, something was still listening. The shard pulsed quietly inside the Valor's hidden chamber, larger than a child's hand, yet its glow was unnatural, dull, and cold, yet never fading. And though the battle of the twin suns had ended in triumph, something unseen had passed through before the rift collapsed. Something that didn't need a ship or a form, only an idea. And now it whispered in the dark corners of the ship, where no eyes could see and no minds could hear. At least not yet. And as the crew repaired damaged systems and celebrated the unity of two great civilizations, Carson Vale felt an unease creeping into his thoughts, not sharp or loud, just a slow chill behind every moment of silence. Varelian sensed it too, though she said nothing at first. Instead, walking the crystal streets of the star-clad court with him at her side, listening to songs of peace sung by her people, watching as humans and Valere shared meals and exchanged gifts, and for the first time, Carson truly believed in the alliance they had formed, not just in war, but in life. And yet, the unease remained, like a shadow at the edge of the sun. And it wasn't until a young Valar child collapsed during a ceremony, eyes wide with terror, that the whispers began to grow louder, heard now by more than just one. Strange words in no known language, spoken in sleep. And when they checked the child's mind with the old Valeri methods, they saw a shape, dark and broken, like a cage made of mirrors, spinning in the center of her dreams. And Carson knew, without needing to ask, that the shard had done this, that it was reaching out. And when he returned to the Valor with Varelian, he ordered a deep scan of the ship, and the shard was found, buried in a sealed container that no one had recorded placing there. And as they stood before it, its glow seemed to brighten, and a soft sound began like metal scraping against stone. But beneath it, a melody, faint and beautiful, like a song played backwards. And Varelian whispered, "It's not dead." And Carson nodded, his hand resting near his blade. But something told him steel would not help here. And so the court met again, this time not in their high halls, but in the Forge Hollow, the deepest part of the planet, where the Heart Forge itself slept once more. And the oldest among them said the shard could not be destroyed by fire or force, 'cause it was a thought, a piece of the obsidian kin's will, and it needed to be rewritten, not shattered. And the only way to do that was through the Song of Iron and Starlight, an ancient Valari ritual once used to reshape broken minds, combining music, memory, and will into one moment of pure creation. But it had not been used in over 1,000 years, for it was dangerous and could break those who tried. And Carson, hearing this, stepped forward and said, "Then we'll try together." And Varelian said nothing. He took his hand and nodded, and so they were brought to the Temple of Resonance, a place carved from starstone and filled with long glass strings that hummed when walked upon. And at the center, they placed a shard, floating above a circle of light. And the moment the ritual began, the song returned louder now, more complex, like it was singing to itself. Carson and Varelian stepped into the circle and opened their minds, letting the Heart Forge flow into them once more. And what they saw was not darkness, but a cold stillness, endless and silent. A space where nothing changed, and in it stood the image of the Obsidian Kin, not as enemies, but as lost ones, beings who had once loved the stars and feared the chaos of life so much that they erased everything to make the universe quiet again. And Carson understood then, the shard was not trying to kill, but to return the world to silence, to convince minds to stop moving, to surrender. And he felt its pull like gravity, peaceful and strong. But Varelian reached out and began to sing, not with words, but with memory, showing it the laughter of her childhood, the feel of rain on silver leaves, the first time she touched Carson's hand, and he joined her, offering memories of earth, of firelight and snowfall, of stories told in dark rooms, and the ache of longing. and their voices grew stronger, weaving together into something new. And the shard trembled, its glow flickering, and in its core appeared a tiny light, like a spark struggling to breathe. And the shard tried to resist, showing them pain, loss, war, betrayal, but they sang louder, not to erase those things, but to accept them, to prove that life was not perfect and didn't need to be. And in that moment, the shard cracked. Not with a scream, but with a sigh, like something letting go after a long time, and the light inside it burst outward, flooding the chamber. And when the glow faded, the shard was gone, and so was the strange song, and silence returned, not cold, but warm. The silence after a story ends, not because it failed, but because it found its voice. And as they stepped from the circle, Beryllian leaned her head against Carson's shoulder, exhausted but smiling, and the court bowed their heads in quiet respect, not just to a warrior and her bond, but to a new legend born from fire, will, and love. And though the stars still held secrets and dangers, something had changed, not in the galaxy, but in the hearts of those who saw what humans and Valari had done together. And across the worlds of both peoples, songs began to spread, not of war, but of unity. And deep in the Heartforge, a new pulse began to beat slower, stronger, ready for the future.